you see our two guests, Susan Sinazi and Brian Lair. Both of them have received the Urban Communication Foundation Award from AEJMC, along with people like Paul Goldberger, Blair Kamen from the Chicago Tribune, and John King from the San Francisco Chronicle. Susan Sinazi is a design advocate, received our award in 2011. She's an internationally recognized authority on sustainability and design, and was the publisher and editor-in-chief of Metropolis from 1986 to 2017. And she's currently the Director of Design Innovation. She holds an MA in Modern European History from Rutgers University. Since 1989, Brian Lair has been confronting urban problems, and his voice comes out to his constituents 5 days a week, from 10 to 12. It's an annoyance to some extent, but you can't miss Brian because his voice is clear, his reasoning is decisive, and I have to go get away from MSNBC for some time. So you can see where I am on the political gambit. The Brian Lair Show is extraordinary. The callers are people who are committed to issues, and often they who call in are the victims of urban injustice and concerns. So, as I said, from 10 to noon on WNYC, 93.9 FM, AM 8201, and Brian goes through this litany of all these stations that somehow are linked to your mighty voice. This program was recognized with a 2007 George Peabody Award for radio that builds community rather than divides. He received as I said, the AEJMC UCF Award in 2018. And just so that you recognize her, Susan Drucker is the Lawrence Stesson Distinguished Professor of Journalism at Hofstra University. She's a notable Mets fan. We have done 2 books on baseball, and Paul Goldberger apparently has just come out with a book on baseball. And she is a native New Yorker, which you can hear sometimes.
I also sound like Mariah.
She also holds a law degree and is a major conspirator with me for the past 35 years. Susan was one of my students, and like many professors, she's taught me everything I know. And the one thing that you'll see why this is connected to environmental design is that I've been a fanatic about cafes and have studied them all over the world. And we decided, let's take a look at New York City to find out where you could have a cafe. And what we found out, and here's where Sue plays a major role, we had to look at the legal restrictions behind the prohibitions, the zoning laws, essentially, that kept certain streets free of cafes. And it's, I think, I don't know when we did that article, but the zoning of social interaction, which we published, I think is still one of the better things we've done. Each of you approach Brian and Susan Susan, the beautiful, not my colleague. Well, or Susan 1 or Susan 2?
Yes, thank you.
This is Susan 1. Okay. Thank you. Each of you approach the urban landscape, particularly in New York City, with a special perspective. And I just want to read something that Susan 1 wrote in Design Advocate, which was published, I think, in 2013. How do people live and work? How has our new relationship with technology changed the daily patterns of urban life? How can we integrate sustainability, history, and technology into our new city forms? Can we have a city less dependent on cars? How can art, memory, spirituality, health, and education get a hearing in the rush to reinvigorate the economy? How do our voices get heard? Well, let's have their voices get heard for a few minutes. And this is going to be quite informal. This program is designed as a discussion. That means that it's not very carefully organized. And we'll start off with some questions, and I'm going to start off with Susan 2 asking the question.
I wanted to come to this from the journalistic point of view. Particularly given the fact that we've just graduated a few hundred journalism students on Sunday, and I think of sending those students out into the world and all the different options that they have to different beats, different approaches to their craft. For me, I look at the city in terms of communication, through communication-colored glasses. And I think a city speaks in many different ways. It speaks through its architecture, it speaks through its policies and regulations, it speaks through its artists, it speaks through its people, and it speaks through its journalists and its critics. And I was particularly interested in the fact that the UN Habitat, the New Urban Agenda, finally really pays some attention to the fact that the journalists that tell the stories of and about the city matter. I can talk more about that, but it got me thinking in terms of the esteemed voices on this panel, and I have to say that I'm very honored to be part of the panel. My questions really emerge out of that notion of journalism. So I wanted to start out just asking, how do you choose the stories of urban life that you choose? How do you choose the stories of architecture that you choose?
Should I start? So I no longer choose because I'm now on my own. But for 31 years, 32 years, I was the one who chose. And how we choose is not about the beautiful and the most crazy shape and how do you place it in architectural history, but it's about how does it hit the ground, who are the people who use it, how are they served, is there a possibility for community, is there a possibility for communication within the building, how does it relate to the historic city, and how does it take the historic city forward to today and into the future. I mean, buildings that are built today are going to be buildings 25, 30, 40, 50 years from now, one hopes. And they say something really damning about our time. I mean, when you think about, for instance, when you think about the cast iron neighborhood in downtown New York where I live, I mean, there was new technology, there was history playing there, there was, a respect for human scale. there was a respect for the neighborhood, and now it's like the buildings that we build can be anywhere. They're looking like corporate towers anywhere. So it really is. It doesn't value the human being while speaking the language of humanity, which pisses me off enormously. Because it's not right. I mean, don't tell me that it's going to serve your lifestyle. You don't have a lifestyle. I mean, you know, it's like we're walking around here. Nobody knows, for instance, where Building 5 is because everything looks the same. I mean, there's no distinguishing mark anywhere. So it is really, really hard to tell a story, but a human story is not hard to tell. An environmental story is not hard to tell because you have to dig in and find the people who are doing interesting things. So I have always been motivated by that instead of the kind of standard architectural criticism. And I loved it because it brought in the world. If it brings in the world, it's a great story. If it leaves most of the world out and just talks about form, it's nothing.
I want to ask Brian a question in terms of the way that Susan has posed it. Let me see if I can get to that area here. Susan, how do I do this? Can you move it? No. The question is this. You call, when we watch you or listen to you,
Brian Lehrer on WNYC, and the globalization of architecture is nothing new. Famous, accomplished architects design buildings all over the world and create diverse skylines. But is it good for architecture and for residents of the cities where these starchitects, that is, star architects, swoop in? My next guest has a few thoughts on that. He is Vito Rybczynski, the Emeritus Professor of Urbanism at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's written about this for the New York Times T Magazine. Hi, Vito. Welcome back to WNYC.
Hi, Brian. Nice to be back.
So, cities and institutions love to hire starchitects these days. It gives off an air of cosmopolitanism and prestige. It means buildings don't all look the same in one place necessarily. They can be adventurous, bring in influences from these stars. What's bad about this?
I think several things. What struck me when I started thinking about it was that how new this wall was. If you went to New York in 1950, you would see only buildings by New Yorkers, with rare exceptions, Frank Lloyd Wright being one of them. But basically, New Yorkers built New York, and then when you went to Chicago, you saw different architects because they were just Chicago architects, and New York architects didn't build in Chicago. So what you said is true. They're exciting buildings, they're different, but they're all starting to look different in the same way. So you get Parisian architects building in New York and in Paris, and then when you go to Paris, you see the same buildings that you just saw in New York. So it does tend to flatten out the landscape.
We can play this for you some other time, but it's an interesting notion, particularly in terms of what's happening in New York at the present time, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But Susan asked about journalists. Are you a journalist or a showman?
I consider myself a journalist. You know, I'm doing a talk show, so in that respect, I host a show. It's not the same as a reporter who is just going out. We're not really doing original reporting on my show in that same sense, like the people in our newsroom are. But we're having conversations, so I'm facilitating conversations about stories in the news, and so it's a journalistic endeavor in that respect. I feel like it's conversation rooted in journalism.
I'll ask you the same question. How do you choose the stories, whether they're the human interest or the architecture?
Well, because it's a conversation show, we try to pick things that lend themselves to people having conversations, to listener participation, because we take call-ins and read tweets on the air and things like that. So not every story that's a good news story necessarily makes a good conversation topic. So that's one way. And we're always trying to represent a variety of voices, including the unrepresented or underrepresented in traditional media. So we're always reaching out in that respect. Give you just a tiny example of the diversity we're going for and how it relates to New York issues in that respect. Just from today's show and tomorrow's show, today we did a segment on the controversy over the specialized high schools admission test. And so our guest was John Liu, the head of the State Senate New York City Education Committee, and he comes out of the Chinese American community in Flushing, which has one relationship in general to this issue. And then also with us for part of the segment, as much as he could join, was Senator Robert Jackson, who's African American and represents Harlem and Washington Heights. And they're trying to work together on that committee to find some kind of consensus solution to this thorny issue that represents, that includes unrepresented or underrepresented voices on various sides. And so we also took phone calls from people. Tomorrow, after we have the mayor at 10 o'clock, which we do every Friday, and let people call in to him and get hopefully underrepresented New Yorkers' voices right there with power every week, we're going to have a segment at 11 o'clock featuring teens in foster care or who were not that long ago in foster care, who contribute to a magazine having to do with foster care, written primarily by foster care teens. So just as those are a couple of examples of how we choose guests.
The theme of humanity seems to be running through this entire conference, so it seems as if there's a variation on that theme.
Can you get rid of that image over here?
Can I ask Brian a question? So are you going to follow up with the mayor and ask him about the hydropower from Canada that he's proposing, that power line?
I'm sorry, what did you ask?
So the Green Initiative,
So if
mayor.
I would ask
Yes.
him, you're asking me to ask him about
Yeah.
that?
I mean, I want to know. This is like he has this big idea of New York green, which is kind of a wonderful idea. It's a really important part of the city. And they're pumping hydropower from Canada, which they have to build an infrastructure for, which relies on another nation, which our current president is constantly battling, and they could shut the borders and shut the pipe off. So, I mean, how does he, I would love to hear how he argues for that, or are there alternatives?
I will try to get that question in maybe tomorrow or maybe some other time. It coincidentally, or maybe this is why you bring it up, just last week, he took a position against the Williams pipeline, which was going to bring natural gas into the city. And, of course, the environmental community opposed that to not build out further fossil fuel infrastructure. But what the mayor cited as the alternative, or one of the alternatives to make up that energy, was the hydropower from Quebec as a clean energy source. So that's the starting point for the follow-up question that I will ask on your behalf.
Good, thank you.
If you look at that image, at that monstrosity that's up here right now, I wonder whether both of you might react to it.
Well, I mean, how do you react to it? It's boring. It's stupid. It's elementary. It has nothing to do with anything but real estate and rentals and developers making their money. It has nothing to do with living. I mean, it's like a cookie cutter that everybody is the same and nobody pays attention to anybody because we're all in the same hell together. And I can't stand these buildings, I have to tell you.
Are you concerned?
Yep.
Can you be more eloquent?
What I'll say, just to be contrarian, this is not my own opinion, but I know that the city, I would say that there was probably a feeling in the the halls of power regarding improving these things, that technology today, building technology, enables yet another layer of skyscraper taller that wasn't enabled before and wasn't possible before. And so when there's one or two or three of them, they look ridiculous and ugly and offensive. When it's the next level of the New York skyline and there's enough of them, then it can be beautiful in its own way. So they argue, and they want the money. They want the money. The de Blasio administration, for example, they're not against market rate housing. They're trying to build a lot of affordable housing to their credit. But they also say we need housing in our housing shortage. And if the oligarchs want to come from Russia and pay, $200 million for an apartment and give the city all that real estate tax, they don't necessarily think that's a bad thing.
If you look at that, and I don't know that it's one of them, there was a time a few years ago where we created bonus plazas in New York City, which meant that the builder could get some extra stories built out if there were conveniences on the ground floor where people could meet each other and so on. Now, recently what I found out, I don't know whether this is one of the buildings, that these are allowed higher heights because in between are the guts of the machine, of the building. That is, the elevator controls and so on are not downstairs. The water is not controls are not downstairs, but they're in the middle of the building, thereby allowing the building to be built higher. Go to the next one. So, why are we having so much trouble? Go on. Huh? Now this is a very interesting building. Susan, is it near where you live? No, it's downtown New York. But read what it says. 1 Manhattan Square is an 800-foot tall modern glass tower located on the edge of the New York Harbor with an epic river and a skyline views. These beautiful homes are wrapped by lush private gardens and over 100,000 square feet of indoor-outdoor amenities. 1 Manhattan Square, a true vertical village. I don't know why that upsets me so much.
Well, and my question is, has anybody been in a village? I mean, a village is where people know each other, know each other's faces, go talk over the back fence, exchange food, exchange information, exchange love. I mean, there's a lot of interaction in those little villages because everybody knows everybody and there's a lot of stuff going on and everybody knows everybody's business. This is not one of those places. I mean, it's not going to have one of those places where people are going to be like friendly with one another, even though they may have a pool or they may have a communal center. Nobody goes there. Everybody is closing their doors and doing something else. Oh, great. That keeps you into... Okay.
Any reaction?
Well, I'll play devil's advocate on this. I've lived in Manhattan apartment buildings most of my adult life, and I feel like there has been community. In one building I lived in when my kids were little, there was a definite community of parents who were sharing all kinds of things. My parents live in a little development of two 20-story condos in Queens, and they're in their 90s. And there's sort of a naturally occurring retirement community in that building along with younger families. And boy, to my parents who moved out of their private home to, you know, because it's easier to live in an apartment when you're that age, boy, have they found community there. A lot of people their age, new friends, you know, that they met after they turned 85. So, I mean, certainly urban living, building living. Now, maybe there's a point beyond a certain number of stories or something like that where it becomes much harder. But I don't know.
One of my favorite questions for students is, do you know your next door neighbor? Brian, do you know your next door neighbor?
I do. You mean on my floor? Yeah,
Yes?
I do.
I do. I do. I know the guy across the street, and I'm not across the hall, and I know the guys next to me, and I know the woman down the hall because we have a laundry room. We meet in the laundry room. We meet in the elevator. We meet on the hallway, and it's one of those kind of intimate old buildings. It's the old hat factory that has been converted into a condo, which kind of is a friendly, kind of tactile place. So the units are very modern, but the actual environment is very textured, and it calls us to be a little bit slower, a little bit more friendly. And this thing, I don't see this thing calling for anything.
How many of you know your next door neighbor? How many of you don't? One honest person. But you do.
I'm an honest lawyer, what can I say?
But if you ask
You live in the suburbs?
if you ask our students, generally they will say, no, I don't care to know my next door neighbor. Can we see the next slide? Hudson Yard. Now I admit I have not gotten down there yet. Any reactions to Hudson Yard? We'll start off with you, Susan.
Okay, so I hated it from the moment they announced it because I knew there was going to be 5 skyscrapers, corporate skyscrapers looking like places to live, not really. It's a corporate environment, and also the idea that yes, they are paying attention to affordable housing, what the city requires, but that's nothing. Most of it is all wealthy people living wealthy lives. Look at the restaurants that are there. Look at the stuff that they're selling there. I just read an article in the New Yorker this morning, actually, where there's a bookstore, and apparently the people who run the bookstore are really being subversive because they're in the middle of all of this wealth, and they have like Marx's books and Angela Davis's books and things that call attention to another way of thinking about the world than the mindset that is provoked by this place. So, and then now that it's finished, and then of course the Heatherwick structure, which is totally meaningless. It's about people taking selfies on this gridded thing. Heatherwick is better than that. He's a really interesting architect. So he sort of gets the big money and builds this structure, and what use is it? It's for people to walk up the whatever 100 or so steps and take their selfies and leave, and then that's it. So, I mean, it's the one-liner. There's no idea behind it. So I think the only thing that appeals to me so far, and I haven't experienced it yet, is the Shed, the theater, the art center, which architecturally really interesting because it uses that FETE fabric, that kind of very strong translucent fabric that can create beautiful kind of almost like a embroidered building, really, but it has all these functions. It has really interesting programs. I don't know how it's going to survive in this place where everything is about the money and shopping and fancy foods and foods that are plates that are so expensive at those restaurants that only the highest level of income can buy. So I have a lot of trouble with the basic idea of what this is, and then the buildings themselves are really boring. The other thing that is offending me enormously is that they haven't even tried one building that has solar technology on its facade. We have now solar cells that can be used on glass buildings. It is not, it's built in the construction and in the architectural mode of 20 years ago. And then they talk about it as the building, the city of the future. Well, if this is our future, we're dead. Because it really is, it doesn't pay attention to climate issues, it doesn't pay attention to energy. It has a kind of a local grid, which I like, so they're not getting their energy from the big stations, the energy stations, but they produce their own energy, which is really, really commendable. But you know, they're burning fossil fuels, so big deal. So again, I don't know. I mean, it's not, Hudson Yards is not something that you want to go back to. It's, you see it, you probably go up the, whatever that thing is, that the Heatherwick thing. I keep blocking it out because the what?
Oculus.
Yeah.
Is that what you're referring to?
The vessel, because nobody, the vessel. So, you know, and I just don't think that it's one of those things that the city has. I mean, it's in my neighborhood, in the old cast iron neighborhoods, you're out all the time. You're being part of that world and noticing new things.
The question is, we've got lots of people who are coming from throughout the country, throughout the world. Is Hudson Yards a place that they should go?
I think just to see it, you should. Never go back again. I mean, once you see it, if you can find it, you should look at the theater, or the art center is called The Shed, and look it up online. Look at the schedule while you're here, what is playing or what is showing. It might be interesting just to attend something there and to experience that building, because that's a very interesting, inventive structure, and also the idea behind it is really interesting because it mixes all the arts. It's theater, it's art, it's music, it's the programming that's going to make it. But again, it's put in the middle of this enclave of wealth, and the city is sort of being invited, but are we? And so, do you really want to go in there? So, Brian, I don't know.
Can I ask how many of you are from out of town? Ah, so many. Well, I happen to know that there is a wonderful thing at the Shed this weekend. I saw it a few weeks ago, called Reich Richter Part. And it's art by Richter, along with music of Arvo Pärt, and live performance, well, they're both live performances, and music by Steve Reich. And the sort of moving minimalism of the visual art and of the music is absolutely wonderful, and there's about 4 showings a day. So if you want to get down there, it's just great. And it's only 50 minutes long, the show. But I certainly agree that the rest of it is, oh my God, I can't believe they built this for opening in 2019. It is the past. And it's an indication of the capture of so much of the city by the real estate interests. And this was in the pipeline for a while. Not, if you don't know the local politics, it got approved and green-lighted and started under construction in the Bloomberg era, and Mayor de Blasio, when this thing opened officially just earlier this year, did not even attend the opening. So it's certainly controversial in that respect, and we need something very different from that if the city is going to be livable from an affordable standpoint, as well as sort of from an ethical, not be the playground for the very rich and everybody else struggling because housing is therefore unaffordable.
If a city speaks through its architecture and some of its major projects, it certainly sounds as if Hudson Yards isn't a story that we really want to repeat. It's a sad story that we don't want to hear. What are the places in New York that you think tell a success story? What are the stories, whether it be on architectural terms or community and human terms, that are the success stories on the landscape?
So I've been looking at these mega projects for the past year and kind of reading up on them and watching them. The one that really intrigues me is Cornell Tech on Roosevelt Island. Because now that's also financed, the big building is financed by Bloomberg and named after his two daughters. But it is, first of all, it's on the island on a floodplain that was raised, the shorelines were raised 6 feet, so it's the 5,000-year flood or whatever it's being thought about. The living places, the dormitories or the apartments that the students and the entrepreneurs will live in is a passive house, which means that it's the biggest passive house that's been built in the U.S., which means insulation is incredibly efficient. There is no, basic, just a minor heating that's needed because it's so protected. There's a great ventilation system. It's angled so that the sun doesn't bake people in there. So I think that, and then there's geothermal power underneath the big building, and there's photovoltaic roof, which is massive on the top of the large building, and that supplies all the energy for that section. So it is as near net zero, which means that they are not spending a dime on Con Edison. They are making their own energy, and it's much cheaper than the Con Edison thing. So I think there's something really interesting there. That's the only development out of the 20 in New York that I found that had an environmental consciousness, a social consciousness, a personal consciousness, because and then it's on this small island that was a throwaway for New York City for a long time, and now it's revived that place. So I'm really looking forward for more of those. And Cornell has a real mission. They want to have not only their students, but the entrepreneurial class that is formed out of all that studying, to understand that they care about the environment, and they encourage that research, that thinking, that use of that technology. So I really think that those places are worth studying, worth spending some time in, and they will set the way. To me, that's the future. Hudson Yards is 1975.
It also reveals yet another paradox, though, because the reason that was created, I think it's fair to say, by Bloomberg, was so there would be an intellectual engine of tech in New York City, so it could attract things like Amazon and make New York even more competitive with Silicon Valley and Boston, et cetera, as a tech hub, which then draws those jobs that makes the city less affordable for the majority of people who live here.
Show the next photograph. Oh, that's the what we've been talking about. Go to the next one. I like this one. Amazon has just canceled its New York City headquarters plan. Here's where the development was supposed to look like, and it's now dead. Comments?
Okay, so 2017 and 18, I was traveling around the country into large architecture offices everywhere in every city. From Pittsburgh to Atlanta, they were all auditioning for the Amazon headquarters, every one of them. And they were going to give their lives to Amazon. And I kept thinking, whatever happened to corporate citizenship? I mean, when you think about it, there's a place called Pullman in Illinois when the Pullman cars for the railroads were built. They were beautiful houses built for workers. When we came to New Brunswick, New Jersey, there was a large Hungarian community that was brought over by Johnson & Johnson. And all of a sudden, I'm walking in the park and I find these beautiful little row houses. That was for the Hungarian workers who came over and worked at Johnson & Johnson. It wasn't the city that paid for it. It wasn't the infrastructure that was needed wasn't paid for the city. It was paid by these companies. Whatever happened to that now? Jeff Bezos is $150 billion and pays no taxes. So I'm really glad that whatever Amazon would have brought to New York, I'm really glad that New York said no, because it sets up a new model. I mean, there are too many giveaways to developers. I mean, I think Hudson Yards got more than Amazon. I mean, I think Amazon was supposed to get, $2 billion? And Hudson Yards got $6 billion or something like that?
That's right. I'm not sure exactly, but I think that's right.
It's sort of the ratio. But it's really interesting because we can't keep doing that. There is a question of corporate citizenship. How do we, if we bring in workers or if we hire workers, how do we set up housing for them? How do they get to their workplaces if they can't walk? So you have to build in the transit, and you can't expect the city to do that. And, I'm not sure that the work and the discovery and all of that ever pays off as much as the city pays these people. So I'm really happy that Amazon is gone.
A few things on that. One, it's really hard for governments to resist the race to the bottom in tax incentive competition. I asked Mayor de Blasio on the air just last Friday, now that you're running for president, since you've always talked about this race to the bottom as a terrible thing, and he was for Amazon coming before he was against it, but that's another story. But okay, great. We just had this debacle having to do with giving unneeded subsidies to, the richest company in the world, the richest man in the world, however we measure it. And so, great, you're running for president. One mayor can't solve this because some other city will compete. And so you can't unilaterally disarm, or your city won't get those jobs that companies feel they can get incentives for. So if you're going to be president of the United States, what can you do at the federal level that puts an umbrella on this and stops this race to the bottom? And he had nothing.
What were your listeners saying?
Well, we haven't had a chance to we haven't done a segment where we've taken specific feedback on that.
Ask him that again.
Say it again?
You have to ask him that again when he comes back.
I will, because his answer was he's just starting to run, so he's just starting to develop position papers, and he'll come out with a series of position papers on all kinds of things. You can be sure that I'll follow up on that particular one.
As president, he's going to have to work with people. And one of the issues with
Use the tense would have to.
No, I mean, everything that I know about the Amazon deal was that the governor and de Blasio, who probably hate one another desperately, they collaborated on this offer to Amazon, and the councilmen, the people who are in the trenches, were not part of it. So how are they, and of course they defeated it. I mean, I think that if they brought along their people and understood how to talk about it and maybe given some give and take to the neighborhoods, I think it could have gone through, but I'm really glad that they didn't, because it isn't.
I agree with you that the worst aspect of it was that they were trying to do an end run around democracy. And you would think Bill de Blasio, with how he positions himself in the world, would have known better or felt differently. Andrew Cuomo, more of, he'll play with power with a little less reflection, I think.
The prince of the Hamlet on the Hudson's prince son.
But, there's also this, yet another set of tensions is that we're in this country that has had a declining middle class for decades. Look at that part of how Trump got elected. And every community, Pittsburgh and Atlanta, which you mentioned, everywhere, is trying to get now good jobs, right? Better high-paying jobs. So can we convert to more of a tech economy? Pittsburgh is doing it with some success, considering what it was, and, as a steel town, and et cetera, et cetera. So you have that draw as an attraction, and then you have citizens like in the anti-Amazon movement here saying, no, don't bring the good jobs, because the good jobs bring too much gentrification.
Now, before I bring it to the audience, because I think you may have some questions or arguments, both of you quickly, how do you feel about sanctuary cities?
I love them. I mean, it's not the way the idiot in the White House is abusing them, but I really do think that it's a really, really nice thing that cities want to help. And cities want to help immigrants, and cities want to kind of figure out how to deal with this, because it's going to be even more. I mean, look at the climate refugees now. Look at, and they tend to be brown and black people from all over those countries. There are the droughts, the no jobs, the crime, all of those things that they're escaping. These are people who are trying to save their children's lives, and they really need help. And I love the idea of sanctuary cities, and I think that's American.
Of course, both of us are immigrants, so we have bias. Ryan?
I think the shame of it is that we have to have so much attention to sanctuary city policies in the first place, because that has to do with that small percentage of immigrants who commit crimes. And that means, if we're talking about that all the time, that Donald Trump and others have successfully made that the topic of conversation when it comes to immigration, while avoiding things like the birth rate in this country is so low that it just declined to a record low, I believe, and we're not at the replacement rate anymore. And one of the reasons that our Social Security system is not crumbling like in some countries in Europe and in Japan is because we have been open to immigrants. I mean, that's just from a purely pragmatic, generational workers standpoint. But there's no better advertisement, for those of you from not New York, there's no better advertisement for, very liberal immigration policies than New York City, where people are from so many different places. We have about 55% of the city population in New York that's either foreign-born or their children. And there is no Tower of Babel in New York City. People are not at each other, and it's a ginned-up thing.
I know that there were questions or comments.
When you get feedback, I'll come out there.
So you can listen on your own time frame and you can see the titles and pick what's of interest.
She doesn't work for me.
I'm a fan. Some of the topics I'm trying to think of: environment, behavior, linking people in place, that I've heard recently, like lead at NYCHA. Parks you often do. Hudson Yards 911 Memorial would be a nice intersection of people in place. Gun safety in schools, public transit, and call-ins about the Amazon, where people were talking about how it would affect them where they live in their community. And so my questions are related to that and the type of stories you can do. Three things. First of all, I'm not thinking that you call in academics. Brian often has people who published a book, and they're often professors. So the question being, if there are more academics perhaps to communicate that there is an academic world focusing on environment behavior, that would be one question. The other is, do you find call-ins particularly useful for reporting on place and space? And lastly, given that you're a non-visual medium, Do you find challenges in any of those topics? And maybe the green space, once you can actually visit Brian in person once a week, is it? Something like that.
It's a month.
Once a month. And so is that a venue where something that's so physical and visual could become even more well delivered?
Thank you for the kind words, first of all. On the green space, it's in the space itself. It's a little theater on the ground floor of the building that houses our station. It has about 100 seats. It has good technology so that we can do all kinds of visuals there. But when we're doing the show live in the green space, it's still primarily for the radio audience, you know, the thousands, not the 100 people who are sitting there. So we have to be mindful that we're doing an audio show. We do sometimes try to discuss and describe visuals on the show. Every year, as just one example, we have a best photo on your phone from this past year contest in December, where people submit, and we create, of course, a web page where people can go and see them, and then we have a professional photographer come in and judge, pick out some of his or her their best from what the listeners have sent in, and then we actually describe what's good about the photos on the phone. We had a guest yesterday who wrote a book called Hair Stories, and it was very much about her photographs of hair, women's hair, and then stories of women's relationship to their hair in all kinds of contexts, and we were describing the visuals. So we have done that with architecture too, from time to time, with Paul Goldberg among others. So there's that. As far as listeners and sense of place, one of the recurring things that we do is call in with your hyper-local headlines. Give us the news from your block, and give us the news from your neighborhood, because it's not going to be in the paper, it's not going to be on the radio otherwise, and through that we're trying to get a sense of place from the many communities around town, as an example.
Or some people would suggest that neighborhoods are dying, that we're losing neighborhoods. I recommend reading Richard Sennett's latest book in terms where he is dealing with porous and non-porous neighborhoods and the effects of gentrification. Another question. Let me go over here. And then...
Hi. I wanted to, I guess, maybe shift the conversation slightly, to a larger sort of journalistic question about discussing architecture, certainly, but also climate, and that's more kind of a rhetorical question. Recently, I've seen a slew of articles about The Guardian changing their style manual and updating language instead of, say, climate change to the climate crisis or something along those lines. I'm wondering if you think about those kind of questions, and are you updating your language architecturally, otherwise? Are there certain terms that this kind of idea is called forward for you, and that you think we should advocate for more?
So I think what we call it really does matter. So when we keep calling it sustainability, we are talking about a 25, 30-year-old word. And that is a minor issue when you come to think about what we know about the kind of losses that we're experiencing around the world. So the climate crisis is the word, and it needs to be dealt with journalistically, investigated, argued, opinionated, every way that you can. I look, every morning when I get up, I look through all the kind of relevant publications that I'm supposed to find something in. It is not being discussed, especially in the architecture publications or architecture-related. Landscape architecture are a little bit closer to it because they have to deal with the ecology and they have to understand. But I really, really feel that journalism is ignoring the story of today. and the story that is going to shape our lives and shape what we are in the next decade. And I think that is unconscionable. I mean, every tweet that idiot puts out is discussed in detail. That is not the story. Let's stop doing that story. Let's start doing the actual climate-related stories where there are people, really good, solid people in architecture, in science, in planning, in all of those areas that in landscape, in philosophy, all of those people need to talk about this. So I really think that we're not tapping it, and I think the Guardian is right. I mean, they try to deal with this almost every issue, but I have to say, it's all about just opinion, and there's not a lot of reporting there. So I want reporting. I want stories.
You had a question?
So, I guess I have a comment in defense of the Kleenex box, as they call it. I'm not sure who called it that, but there's this fascinating interaction with the building that happens as a measure not of the building being in the foreground, but the building being in the middle ground, that you experience from Park Avenue, not because I own real estate there, but because it's public space. That you also experience from Central Park at certain times of day. And I think the way that we digest buildings in media is very different than the lived experience of buildings in the city when you're an active participant in...
Are you talking about that super tall?
I am, yeah. And then I kind of want to bring that back to Hudson Yards and ask a question that in 1971, I believe there was a public sculpture that was removed from a plaza. And I'm wondering, we don't have any agency to ask for things to go elsewhere or to dissolve or to behave differently. And Tilted Arc was something that happened here in New York, and that there's no recourse to action because real estate and private interests have sort of dominated public space in some kind of way that agency is lost. And it's a problem.
Any reactions to what you said? I have a question, and that is, would Jane Jacobs have anything to say about cell phones?
About what? About what? Cell phones?
Cell phones, yes. I mean, has the world changed?
Yes.
What we demand of public space, because everyone has a cell phone in their hands.
Well, and I think one of the issues, and I walk around a lot, and I live in the NYU area where everybody's on their phones. I mean, they are coming at me. If I don't watch it, they're going to knock me over. They're coming at me this way. And they cross the street against the light. They are incredibly involved in something else than the street, than New York, than the place where they are. And how do we sort of, I don't know what happens here, but it is very annoying for people who are trying to get around, and people who are like, also, I'm interested in seeing what's around me. I'm interested in building. I'm interested in how something grows, how, a new family of birds just moved into one of our trees. And they're not looking at anything. So yes, the cell phone has turned into something that is a substitute for friendship, for reality, for knowledge, for anything. And I think what's really interesting that Silicon Valley is stopping their kids from using it all the time. So it is, even they know that this is going in the wrong direction.
I have.
How much time do we have left? Just a couple of minutes, right? Well, Brian, go ahead.
I was just thinking about Jane Jacobs this morning, reading Farhad Manjoo's article in the New York Times, his column, which in a way certainly didn't cite Jane Jacobs. I don't know if it's fair to say that it's a not Jane Jacobsian vision of progressive cities, but he was talking about density. and that if we want to deal with the climate crisis and the affordability crisis brought by tech and employers like Amazon, that we need to build high around transit. That's Mayor de Blasio's vision too. And I think that there are these two kind of both coming from a good place, competing visions of the livable city and the progressive city. And one is less dense and one is more dense. And it's, this is where we are. Very, very unresolved, but this is where we are.
Well, when Brian came earlier, I mentioned to him smart cities. I don't know how many of you have been to a smart city. I've been to Songdo, outside of Seoul, and it's a city created by Cisco, essentially, and it's one of the scariest things I've ever seen in my life. It's total surveillance, and it's the smart city, and it has other names. Susan, what are they called now?
Jan Gehl was talking about the failure of Brasilia. I kept thinking of the failure of the smart city. Many of the same issues emerged.
Any other questions? Well,
Did Dave have a, I think there's...
go ahead.
You know, when you look at China, with the goal of moving 350 million people into the cities in the next 20 years, and they've built 10 cities of 10 million, the potential of 10 million that no one's living in. And we talk about density, and we talk about healthy cities, and we talk about walkable cities. But to me, there's something going on where the farmer in agriculture is losing money and losing the ability to support themselves. I think there's some kind of, I hate to sound paranoid, but I think governments want us to move to the city because they want to control, like you were talking about smart cities being totally under observation. And you see cameras everywhere, and it's kind of scary to me to see how we're being tried to be controlled. And we're designing, as EDRA people, we're designing walkable, livable, healthy cities, but we're doing it in the context of what's happening.
Susan and I were in Beijing and Shanghai just before the Olympics, and we saw some of the, whatever they call some of these communities, actually destroyed in front of our eyes. It was extraordinary. What are they called?
Oh, the Houtons and...
Bhutans, yeah. I could go on because I love these two people. They're very special. So let's give them an ovation. Thank you very much. Say hello to Eric.